I remember coming home after doing 2 of them, and I did 2 in the same day, and they both said, yes, I'll do it. And I remember sitting down at our kitchen table, and my wife's like, hey, how did it go today? And I'm like, well, if I did all this paperwork right, I think I just bought 2 houses. And she's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, that class called Subject to, and I think I did it. And then I figured out, man, if I could do a couple, man, maybe I could do even more. Mm-hmm. And that was our big strategy when we first got into real estate. Welcome back.
Episode number 3.
Episode number 3, Massive and Passive Podcast. I love that.
Yeah.
So that's a good job. Colter kind of put that in together, and I like it. I like it a lot.
Yeah, no, we're excited to be talking about massive and passive incomes and being able to create, wealth through real estate and business and investing. And anyways, looking forward to visiting some more about how we've done that. And the topic today we've chosen is
Subject to. And that might sound like a funny name. In fact, the first time I heard it, I was like, subject to what? But it actually does mean that, subject to existing financing. Mm-hmm. And people throw that around a lot, like, oh, I think I can do subject to on this, subject to on that. But a lot of times people don't understand exactly what it means. So let's dig into it. I would love to dig into it, kind of say how you set one up, how you execute one, and then what the long-term strategy for most subject twos are.
Yeah, and I think it's important because a lot of people will talk about subject twos and they'll also talk about wraparounds in the same sentence, right? Yeah. And they have, they are very similar in nature, right? Uh-huh. But the subject to is basically saying, I am buying this property, and when you go to buy a property, you want to get title insurance. You want to make sure that you're buying the property either free and clear or with the encumbrances that you expect to be against that property. So you're always going to have an encumbrance of property taxes. Mm-hmm. You're always going to have an encumbrance of like utility easements, not always, but utility easements, and then subject to the actual lot lines and the legal description. And then you have, encumbrances like a mortgage, or, other mechanics liens, that kind of thing. And so when you buy a property subject to, you're buying it subject to certain terms and conditions that leave certain notes or liens and encumbrances against the property.
Yeah, and that could also be subject to things that you'll do, things that they will do, expectations that are supposed to be met. It can mean quite a bit. So I'm glad you explained that a little bit too, and I'm glad you made the reference between owner. What'd you say?
The wraparound.
Wraparound, yeah. Or some people think it's owner financing, which it kind of is, but it's not, because the subject to part of it takes you out of it, but makes you responsible for the mortgage. So that's the brilliance behind it. And then also through subject to, most people are either behind on payments, maybe they lost a job, whatever it may be. There may be all sorts of things, or they're over leveraged in the property, or maybe they just got to move and they got to move quick, and there's not much equity in it, so they couldn't sell it for very much, or they can't even maybe they can't even pay the realtor fees to sell it. There's all sorts of reasons why somebody would do a subject to, because a lot of people are like, well, who would do that once you explain it? Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I want to really just dig into explain exactly what it is, exactly how it benefits you, how it benefits the person, because the person who owns the property, it's a win for him, it's a win for me, it's a win for, could be somebody else that might be coming in and renting the property for a time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a brilliant strategy. It really is, because it's a way to get into properties without much money. And I remember when I first got into first couple of deals, I took a class on subject twos, and it was just a day class. You probably took it too, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember going through it, and I'm like, there's no way that works. Like it almost sounded too good to be true, right? But I remember going through and looking at all the documents, looking at all the stuff, and going through the class. And then I remember sitting down in front of somebody, and I had some things I was going to say, and I had some papers for them to sign, and I remember explaining it all to them, and they said, okay, sounds good. How do we make this happen? And I'm like, hold on a second. So I kind of read through some of my papers, and I'm like, well, you need to sign on this, you need to sign on this, and then I'll sign, and you sign. And I remember coming home after doing 2 of them, and I did 2 in the same day, and they both said, yes, I'll do it. And I remember sitting down at our kitchen table, and my wife's like, hey, how did it go today? And I'm like, well, if I did all this paperwork right, I think I just bought 2 houses. And she's like, what? What are you talking about? And I'm like, well, you know that class called Subject 2? And you know, I think I did it. And then I figured out, man, if I could do a couple, man, maybe I could do even more. And that was our big strategy when we first got into real estate.
Yeah, no, and I remember the very first one that I did, and I was talking to the folks and going through the documents in a very similar way that you did. But they had called me and said, we're in this position, we're moving out of state, we're in the middle of like 12 projects. There was literally a hole in the floor in this master bedroom down into the basement. I mean, 3/4 of the flooring was gone, and you would have fallen right through if you would have just opened the door and stepped in. Like and so they're in the middle of all these projects, and then they get a job that takes them out of state, and they're like, we don't know what to do. And the house was, you know, fixed up at the time, was maybe worth $100,000, and they had at least $20,000 worth of work that needed to be done immediately. And, you know, getting into the details and everything, they didn't have that to be able to put into the property to try and fix it up to then be able to sell it. And they also just wanted to move on. You know, they had been in the middle of these.
That's the way it is for most people. They just want to get out of it.
They do, yeah. And it's worth it to them, because even if they would have fixed it up to where it was worth $100,000, then they pay all the fees that it takes to dispose of a house or sell it, right, at the very end, and
concessions.
Yeah, so they're looking at a pretty big bill. And I look at that deal, and I bought it subject to, they actually paid me $1,000 so that we could take care of it the next 2 months, because they knew I was going to be putting tens of thousands into it to fix it up. And they gave me $1,000, and I started taking over the payments and subject to, and they loved it. I mean, I was talking to them 3, 4, 5 years later, and they were still super happy about everything that and how it went down. And
that's awesome.
Ultimately, they were able to move on, and they were in a career and the place that they wanted to be, and the subject to solution worked for them, and it worked for me, and how I ended up fixing up that property. And you know, the details of that is I ended up building, you know, $30,000+ in equity in a house that took about 18 months to get fixed up to the point where it was worth more. But I lucked out and had a tenant that was moving out of another rental of mine and wanted a place, and happened to be a handyman and just wanted to kind of do his own thing. Yeah. And I was like, well, what about this?
Yeah.
You know, you move in here, and in exchange for your rent, you work on this house, and I'll pay for the materials.
Nice.
And he did that for, I think it was about 14 to 16 months, and then he moved out about 18 months later. And this cute little house, didn't have a hole in the floor in the master bedroom anymore, and it just a great little property for us, and we've held it ever since. You know,
you still have it?
Oh yeah, 10+ years later.
That's awesome.
I have it. It's paid off. I actually have a line of credit against it for a whole bunch of other reasons.
Nice.
But
nice.
Yeah, it's a great little property.
That's what's so great about real estate. And I want to go back and talk about your story just real quick, because not only did you create a win for the person who owned the property, you created a win for yourself, but then you created a win for the tenant. So that was a triple win, which that's I think a lot of times we forget as real estate investors, the more creative you get, the more wins you can make, but not only wins, but also how you can help and problem solve. I realized a long time ago when I very first got going that we're problem solvers. Somebody's got a problem. They either can't make their payments, they're behind on their mortgage, they can't sell a property, whatever it may be. Maybe they can't manage it. They want to retire. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why people either get into real estate and then need to get out of real estate. And because of whatever reason they need to get in, or the reason they need to get out, or the reason they need to rent, it really doesn't matter. But what's awesome is if you have the right knowledge and the right creativity, and don't ever say, why can't we? You always say, why can't we? Did that make sense? Why can't we? How come we can't? I don't know. Maybe I got confused there. But anyways, it's not about this isn't going to work. It's how can we make it work? There we go. That's a lot better. Yeah. And always think, how can we make this a win-win? And I can almost guarantee across the board, not every deal goes awesome, but most go well. And I think the reason why they go well is because most investors always have the outlook of the best possible way for not only to help somebody, but then also to help yourself. And I think if you can keep that in mind, man, it just seems like not only do we make some great money and have some great strategies and plan for retirement and make some massive and passive income, but we help a lot of people on the way. I think that's probably half the joy. Anybody that says it's all about helping people, it is. But if you didn't make any money, nobody'd be helping people.
Yeah, I mean the helping people comes down to is that we're feeding our families as well. You know, I need to make a return on my investment because of the efforts and the time and the energy and the resources that I've put into a property. You know, and so my motives is that I would not invest in real estate if it didn't have a return.
Definitely.
An ability to pay me. And so, yeah, absolutely. And we are problem solvers, right?
Yep.
And it's aligning what it is that somebody approaches us with as the problem and identifying the core issues in there to then find the solution that allows for somebody to move on.
Yeah.
You know, if I look at those folks that needed to relocate out of state in my scenario, is their problems were they had a job, it was 4 hours away, they had 12 projects going on, they needed to rent another place, they needed to come up with deposit, they needed to
Stop the bleeding.
They needed to stop the bleeding in the one house that,
Yep.
that is nowhere near habitable for a tenant. And so they end up adding up all of these problems, and 6, 8, 10 problems later, they're like, we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And then, so if somebody comes in with a solution that says, I can solve 4 of your 10 problems by doing X and Y and Z, and it's a benefit to them, and they can say, I can move on with my life and be able to focus on the now issues that continue after them selling a house, that's what we're solving.
That's
right?
awesome. Yeah.
And they're happy, and I'm happy, and whoever moves into the house next is happy because we've created that win-win-win situation.
That's awesome. So now we kind of established, why we do a subject to. Let's break it down on what a subject to is. And we talked a little bit subject to, existing finance or something, but so let's break in a scenario. So somebody is behind on their payments, or somebody is moving out of state, whatever it may be. So what does that actually mean to take over that property subject to existing financing? What am I in charge of, and what are they in charge of? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and I think that really what it comes down to is we're going to make the payment.
There you go. Yep.
That's all there is to it. We've come in to make the promise to say we're going to make this payment on this house as is, and you're going to be able to move on to to wherever next is. And we should ask and invite and expect them to also communicate in the future, because we're also going to be dealing with a bank that has given this person, the seller, the financing. Mm-hmm. Now we are taking that financing and the responsibility of making that payment, but that person still has, responsibility to report and to provide us the information so that we can make that payment. Because if Chase Bank or Wells Fargo or any other bank were to come back and say, hey, I've got questions X and Y and Z, it may require some communication from that person, which is, in my experience in 10 years, I had that happen to me twice.
Yeah.
They really don't care as long as that payment is being made, as long as I can log in and see that mortgage. They don't care.
I'm glad you brought that up, because sometimes not only do we make the payment each month, but sometimes we have to catch them up. I know I've brought to the table $3,000, even $4,000 to catch them up on their back payments and then take over their payments. And that can solve a lot of problem too, because that stops the phone from ringing. That stops them from collections, whatever it may be. And so I give them, $2,000 or $3,000, or depending on what they're behind. And sometimes I even give them a little extra money on top to get them to move. There was a lady in Boise that we moved all the way to Oregon. And so I hooked up I had a 25-foot car hauler at that time. We hooked it up and we loaded all of her stuff that would fit in the back of the bed of my pickup and in her car, and we drove her to Oregon. And I didn't charge her anything for that, because I took the house subject to the existing financing, took over the payments, caught her up on her behind payments, and then I moved her to Oregon. And then when we got to Oregon, I made the payment on her apartment for 3 months and made the storage unit payment for 3 months, just to help her out, because there was a bunch of equity in there. So what's great about that is not only can we help them out, we can catch them up on their payments, but then we can kind of give them a good start. And you know, I mean, I could have probably said, no, I'm not going to give you anything. I'm not going to help you out. You know, I'm just going to take over the payments, and you're stuck with whatever you're doing. But by treating her as well as we did and helping her out go to Oregon, do you know I got 2 other subject twos from referrals from her, from friends and a family member that was also behind on payments, that was also struggling, and they had equity in their property. But I mean, this lady was a hoarder. So how I got it is a realtor came in to list it, and the realtor's like, I can't list this property. There's no way. It's got to be cleaned up. So another realtor friend of mine heard about it and said, hey, I got a buddy, Jason, that works on this type of stuff. Sat down and talked to her, and I mean, we took 2 semi-loads to the dumpster. We had a garage sale for 2 weeks. I mean, we really helped her solve some big problems.
Sure.
And we did really well on the property. Not only did we have his expenses, we probably had 15 just to take care of behind payments, monthly payments, and to move to Oregon, and to, you know, help out with rent or whatever else. But we did really well on the other side. And it took us about 3 months to clean that property up. And then we had to, I mean, it was full of mice. I mean, whatever it may be. And so the big thing is I want people to know every subject to is different. Every one of them is different. It's the same process, but there maybe you have to catch somebody up on payments, and maybe you just take over payments, and maybe you have to give them some cash up front. It just depends on how much equity. There's only $20,000 equity. There's not much room of giving them extra money. But if there's $150,000 equity, then hey, there's some room to really help these people out, and there's some room for you to make some great money. The big thing, let's talk about the back end on it. I'll let you kind of lead out on that one.
Yeah, and on the back end, I guess before we dive into that, I just mentioned one thing is, you know, after listening to your scenario, who knows, I mean, let's say you had $100,000 in equity that you were stepping into, and some people would think, well, that's way too much. You should give somebody, you know, $80,000 for them to move out. Well, maybe in a scenario that could make sense.
Yeah.
And then you could look on the other side, like, well, Colter, you're a jerk. Why did you take $1,000 to take over those notes? It's like, because they were going to make that payment for the next year, and they would never have sold it because it was 2011, and there was no real other solution. It was that they were stuck in these payments in the middle of all these projects. And so the balancing act is solving the problem. That's all people want in the moment. And you solving the problem to where you're paying for expenses to move to Oregon, you're paying for, you know, them to, you know, for rent, etc. Ultimately, you solved her problem, and there was an upside to you still.
Definitely. By
being able to come in with that. In my position at that point in my career, I didn't have a whole lot of extra either, and so me solving their problem was not coming in with a whole lot extra. And still, you know, I'm still very risk averse. And at the end of the day, I had proposed a solution to them, and it was up to them to accept it or to not. And that's all there was to it. They ended up accepting, and it works out for me in the long term. But ultimately, that's what we're looking for. It works out for them and for us, and for whoever else gets involved. So now let's dive into the back end. I think. That's
I wonder if we ought to do a number 2 in subject 2.
I think we
should. Because I think we're already out of time, and I want to make sure I respect people's time and what they're doing. But I think we could do another segment on subject 2 and talk about the back end.
Absolutely.
Does that sound good?
Yeah. Let's do that.
Let's do it. All right. Awesome. Hey, thanks everybody for tuning in. It's always a pleasure to hang out with Colter. So much knowledge that he's got, and to be able to bounce ideas and maybe help you to be able to achieve whatever they want to achieve.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love talking to Jason, and we're going to do this more and more, and can't wait to, you know, pick out those golden nuggets that have helped us over the years, and we hope that it'll help others that want to succeed in real estate, buy their own home, their first home,
get their first rental,
figure out how to sell their home if they're in the position that they need to do that, and, you know, need to save some money or need to find other alternative solutions because of the market that we're in. So absolutely.
Awesome.
Part 2 will be coming on the back end of what subject 2 actually means.
So we'll check you out then.
Okay.